GPU mining rigs, mini box miners, CPU mining rigs, and full-size ASIC miners all have one thing in common. They generate a lot of heat and quickly warm up any room that you put them in. And that's because with electronics like these, close to 100% of all the power that they use is converted directly into heat, meaning an ASIC miner that pulls 3000 watts of power is therefore also generating 3000 watts of heat. And if they are just left running with no cooling solution, they will quickly turn any room that you put them in into a sauna before overheating and shutting off. Or in a worst case scenario, the mining equipment might even break due to heat damage. So let's look at how to deal with all of this heat, starting with just the general mechanics of how to actually get it done. And after that, I'll explain in simple terms how to accurately calculate the airflow you need based on the size of your mining farm. And finally, we'll move on to some example setups that people are effectively using to keep their mining farms cool. And this guide applies to basically anyone who is mining, no matter if you just have a couple of GPUs or if you're setting up a 10 megawatt industrial mining farm. So that's what's coming up in this video after a quick word from our sponsor. Coin Mining Central is an online store for ASIC miners, and there's no doubt that right now ASIC mining profitability has just been going up like crazy in these past few months. And the miners that I'm personally most interested in right now are probably the Iceriver AL0 Home, a lithium miner, and the Jasminer X16Q, which I still think is probably the best ASIC miner available for at-home miners like myself. Coin Mining Central are also continuously providing me with exclusive discount codes for you guys, like the code 𝗧, which gives you $125 off on every miner in your order. I am also very excited to tell you that Coin Mining Central have recently launched a loyalty program that lets you earn points in loads of different ways, like signing up for their newsletter or following them on social media. You also earn points on every order you make with them, and these loyalty points can then be redeemed for massive discounts on your next purchase. Now, on top of this, with Coin Mining Central, worldwide express shipping is always free, and there are never any added payment fees during checkout or anything like that. The listed price is always the total cost you'll pay for the miners. And I did a lot of research before I decided to partner up with Coin Mining Central, and there were two clear things that stood out to me about them. The first one being that as opposed to most other ASIC vendors that are based overseas, Coin Mining Central is registered and run out of England, Europe, which means they have to adhere to the very strict regulations for customer support and personal detail protection that we have over here. And of course, all brand new miners also come with a full manufacturer warranty. The second thing is their pretty much spotless track record of delivering miners to happy customers like you guys for well over 5 years at this point. So please go check them out today. I'll have the discount codes and link for you down in the video description. So since our mining equipment produces all of this warm air, an initial reaction might be that we need to take that air and cool it back down again using something like air conditioning. However, while this could work in theory, usually it's a highly ineffective and expensive way of managing the heat produced by your mining equipment. This is because not only are air conditioning units usually pretty pricey in and of themselves, but also cooling a room with AC uses a lot of electricity, which will also cost a lot of money. However, a common misunderstanding here is that you need the same amount of power to cool a room with AC as the power used by the equipment heating the room. So for example, if you are running a mining rig that pulls 1000 watts of power, which then in turn produces 1000 watts of heat, you'd also need to run an additional 1000 watts of air conditioning to offset that heat. But thankfully, this is not true. You see, modern AC units are a lot more efficient than that, and this efficiency is stated by the unit's COP measure, short for coefficient of performance, which basically is just the ratio between how much power you put in versus how much cooling you get out. And a common range for the COP of modern AC units is about 4, meaning for every watt of power it uses, you are offsetting 4 times that amount of heat. So to offset the heat produced by that 1000-watt mining rig, you'd need to use about 250 watts of air conditioning, as 250 times 4 equals 1000. So basically, whatever wattage your mining farm uses, add an extra 25% to that if you were to cool it using air conditioning. Now, using an extra 25% of power just to offset the heat of your mining farm is definitely significant. This is because in mining, our one big operational cost is the power that we use. So obviously we want to keep this as low as possible. And thankfully, we can use significantly less than that 25% extra. And I'll tell you how in this next section. So the good news here is that we don't need to offset all the heat produced by our mining equipment by cooling that hot air down again. Instead, we just need to get rid of that hot air and replace it with new air. You see, most mining equipment is totally fine to run in temperatures of up to 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning as long as the ambient air temperature in your area isn't above that, you can just replace the hot air produced by your mining equipment with ambient air to effectively keep things cool. And thankfully, replacing air is generally a lot more power efficient than cooling air down. And don't worry, a bit later in the video we're going to touch on what you can do if your ambient temperatures are hotter than that as well. So to replace air, we can use both active and completely passive means, or a combination of the two. An example of an active solution would be something like an exhaust fan blowing the hot air produced by your miners out of the room through a window, and an example of a passive solution would be something like just piping the exhaust side of an ASIC miner directly out of the room through an exhaust vent. And okay, maybe that's not technically a passive solution, as you're still having the built-in ASIC fan actively pushing the air out the vent, but those fans would be running no matter what, so I'm counting it as a passive solution since no additional power is being used. And we'll look closer at both active and passive air replacement solutions a bit later in the video, where I show off some effective examples of mining farm cooling setups. First, we need to look at how much air we actually need to replace. So in this next section, I'm going to teach you how to calculate just how much airflow you need in order to replace enough air in your mining farm to keep the temperatures at a good level. This is because the more mining equipment you have running and the more power it uses, more heat is being generated, and therefore you need to replace the air at a quicker rate than if you had less equipment running. Basically, the more heat that is being produced, the quicker you need to replace the air. And the quicker you need to replace the air, the more airflow you need. But before we start, there are two quick things that I need you to keep in mind. The first one is that these calculations we are going to do are based on setting up a fully active air replacement solution. So if you are able to partially or fully replace air with a passive solution, then your required airflow might be significantly less. Secondly, when talking about airflow, we need to take into account both intake and exhaust. This is because you might get exhaust fans that meet the required airflow for your farm, but if there isn't enough intake of new air available, not enough air will actually be replaced, even though your exhaust fans technically might meet the required spec. So we'll get more into the intake side of things in just a bit, but for now, let's look at the three variables that are actually at play when it comes to calculating required airflow. Number one, the total electricity used by all of your mining equipment in the room you are trying to keep cool enough for mining. Specifically, we are looking at the wattage here, as the watts of power used by your mining gear is basically equal to the watts of heat it produces. Number two, the maximum temperature difference that would be safe in your situation. So what this means is, how much hotter than the ambient temperature can your mining room be while still being safe? For example, if the hottest ambient temperature in your area is 80 degrees Fahrenheit and you never want your mining room being any hotter than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, then the maximum safe temperature difference is 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And number three, the amount of airflow required, which is the thing we are actually trying to figure out here. This is a spec that most airflow products, like intake or exhaust fans, have specified in their technical details, and this is usually defined using the unit CFM, cubic feet per minute, which is what we'll be using here as well. And the formula to calculate it all is actually pretty straightforward, and it looks like this. First you take the equipment power in watts and you multiply that by 3.097, and whatever you get then, you divide by the temperature difference in Fahrenheit, and that will give you the needed airflow in CFM. Or if you are using Celsius, then again you take the equipment power in watts and you multiply that by 1.721 instead, and then whatever you get, divide that by the temperature difference in Celsius, and again you'll get the needed airflow in CFM. So let's apply this to a real life example. If you have 3 full-size ASIC miners running in a room, each pulling around 3,300 watts, so in total roughly 10,000 watts of power, and we never want the temperature in that room to be more than 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the temperature of the ambient air that we are getting in through our intake, then our equation would look like this. 10,000 times 3.097 divided by 20, which gives us 1548.5. Or, in other words, in a room running 10,000 watts of mining equipment, you need just over 1500 CFM of airflow to make sure the temperature stays no hotter than 20 degrees Fahrenheit above the temperature that you're getting through your intake, basically. And for example, that could easily be handled by just one of these AC Infinity exhaust fans, which I guess I'll put that up on the screen here, because those can provide more than twice that amount of airflow. And this exhaust fan only uses at most 230 watts. So for those of you remembering from earlier when we spoke about using air conditioning, how you need about 25% of extra power to cool your mining farm using AC, which in this case of using 10,000 watts of mining equipment would mean you'd need about 2,500 watts of additional power to cool it with AC. Here you'd be using less than a tenth of that, not even 2.3% of extra power instead of 25% of extra power. So this is a very good example of why just replacing the hot air is a lot more efficient than cooling it. Now, of course, that is only true if you are able to replace that hot air with ambient temperature air, which is cool enough for your mining equipment to operate in without issue. So next, let's quickly look at what to do if you are setting your mining farm up in a place where temperatures are a lot hotter than that. So as we touched on earlier, most mining equipment is fine to run in ambient temperatures of up to 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Meaning if temperatures in your area normally stay at or below something like 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you could just calculate the required airflow to keep your farm within 10 degrees Fahrenheit of your ambient temperature using the formula that we just learned, and you should be fine. But what if your ambient temperatures are above safe already to begin with? Well, thankfully, there are a few things we can do to set up proper cooling even then. Starting with, if your ambient temperatures are normally safe, except for maybe just a few days during the hottest weeks of summer where it might get up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so, just for a few days, then you might just want to consider shutting your mining farm off on just those few days each year. That's because that is probably going to be a lot more cost efficient than spending money building out your cooling setup just for a few days of heat each year. Sure, you'd miss a few days of mining each year, but you also don't have to buy a bunch of additional cooling equipment. Now, that said, if you actually do routinely have ambient temperatures that are above safe for mining hardware, like several months in a row of temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, then I've got two solutions for you still. First solution is to just focus on buying mining hardware that can operate in higher temperatures. I understand that this isn't an option for everybody, but for example, if you are planning out a new mining farm build in a hot area, there are a lot of mining equipment that is specifically designed to run in hotter climates, and going for those might be a more economical option than building out an additional cooling infrastructure for your mining farm just to be able to run less heat resilient mining gear. The first example of a miner like this that comes to mind is the Bitmain T21, which is a Bitcoin ASIC that can tolerate ambient temperatures of up to at least 113 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're interested in that, I'll leave a link to it down in the video description. Now, of course, if that's not an option, going for more heat-resistant mining equipment, then as a last resort, we can still look into cooling the air. But thankfully, as we've learned that removing the hot air produced by the mining equipment is a lot more efficient than cooling it back down again, we can still use that to our advantage. And that is because even in a situation with very hot ambient temperatures, we still don't need to cool down the hot air produced by the mining equipment. Instead, we just need to cool down the ambient air that we are supplying the mining farm with through our intake, and getting that air down to low enough temperatures for our mining equipment to operate safely. So again, you don't need to cool down the hot air produced by your mining equipment. It's still much more efficient to just exhaust that. You just need to cool down the ambient air coming through your intakes. And thankfully, this can be done pretty power efficiently. For example, if you live in a dry climate, then evaporative coolers offer really good cooling to power consumption performance, and can be used pretty efficiently to get your intake air cool enough for mining. If you live in a humid environment, however, well, then I don't really have any great suggestions for you. Evaporative coolers don't work as well, and you don't want the air getting too humid as that could damage your mining equipment. Actually, you might have to look into AC for cooling your intake air in this case, or I don't know, maybe do some further research into other solutions. Now, keep in mind that you only need to do all of this if the ambient temperatures in your area are close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods of time. Otherwise, just proper airflow and possibly having to shut your mining farm off for a few days during peak ambient temperatures is most likely a much better option. So, to get your mining space set up to handle the heat generated by your mining equipment, there are a few things to keep in mind. The big one is obviously how much actual airflow we need to replace enough air in the space to keep temperatures in check. But we've already gone through that in depth. So let's instead move on to 4 other smaller things that might not be as obvious, but are still really important. Starting with, make sure you are properly and fully removing the warm air. For example, if you're using an exhaust fan, make sure it is exhausting the hot air completely away from the room and that it is all completely gone after being exhausted. You don't want it to just be, piping it into a room next door, as that room will then warm up and that heat will then spread back into your mining room. The heat you're exhausting needs to be completely removed. For example, by being piped directly out of the building. And on that note, the second additional thing to keep in mind when setting up mining farm cooling is that, in general, it is a lot easier to deal with an enclosed space, like a grow tent, a small insulated room, or even a dedicated shed if you can. This is because it gives you a lot more direct control of the airflow, and it also limits the heat leaking into places where it shouldn't. And moving on, the third thing to keep in mind is that you need to set your mining space up in a way where all the hot air generated by the mining equipment actually can be properly removed and replaced with new ambient temperature air. We need to remember that air tends to flow through the path of least resistance and that heat rises. And these two things can lead to hot pockets forming in certain areas of your mining space, meaning heat can start building up in places where the air isn't being sufficiently replaced. To avoid this, simply make sure that all the hot air generated by your mining gear can properly be exhausted before it gets a chance to start building up somewhere. For example, by placing your equipment as close to the exhausts as possible and aiming the side where the heat comes out of your miners towards the exhaust. And the fourth and final thing to remember is the relation between exhaust and intake. And I actually think that this is important enough that it requires its own section. So in order to replace the air in our mining farm, we not only need to exhaust the warm air out, but we also need to take new air in. So for example, if you're using an active exhaust fan with enough CFM as calculated earlier in the airflow formula, you can either pair that with an active intake fan, or you can let the negative pressure that the exhaust fan creates automatically move new air into the room through passive intakes. But how much active or passive intake do you need? Well, active is easy. You simply just need the same amount of CFM as calculated earlier in the airflow formula. So if we again use the result from our example earlier, which required just over 1500 CFM of airflow, that means that if we are going to go for a fully active setup, we need both 1500 CFM of active exhaust and 1500 CFM of active intake. So for a fully active setup, you just need to make sure that both the exhaust and the intake fans meet their airflow requirement, and that they match each other as to not create any pressure differences. But what about passive intake? Well, what this usually looks like practically is simply adding intake vents to your mining space. These vents allow fresh air to be moved in, and then that air gets warmed up by your mining equipment, and then finally it gets exhausted out by your exhaust fans. Although the big question here is, how much passive intake do you need to satisfy the airflow of your exhaust fans? Because it doesn't matter if you put 10,000 CFM of exhaust fans on a completely airtight room. You wouldn't get any real airflow since it couldn't replace the air it is trying to exhaust. So how much passive intake do we actually need? Well, after a good amount of research into airflow formulas, I kind of came up with a good rule of thumb, which is that for every 100 CFM of required airflow, you need about 40 square inches of completely unrestricted intake. Or in metric, that's roughly 250 square centimeters of completely unrestricted intake per 100 CFM of required airflow. Now, that completely unrestricted part is very important here, as any restriction significantly reduces how much air can be sucked in through a passive intake. And Also keep in mind that intake area refers to the actual size of the path into your room. So if you are, for example, using gable vents on your intakes, it doesn't refer to the hole in your wall that the gable vent is covering. It is referring to the actual size of the slits in those vents. And going a step further with this, it's usually a very good idea to use some sort of air filter on your intakes to avoid dust, pollen, and debris building up on and in your mining equipment. But of course, air filters will highly restrict the possible airflow through an intake. Obviously, how much restriction depends on the actual filter, and usually higher MERV rating means more restriction to the airflow. But another good rule of thumb here is to probably increase the intake size by at least 50% if you are to cover them in air filters. So in this case, you want about 60 square inches or 375 square centimeters of passive intake per 100 CFM of exhaust. Alright, so let's quickly summarize what we've learned so far before moving into some real-life examples of effective mining farm cooling setups. First, we need to figure out how much airflow we need. We do this by first seeing what the hottest ambient temperature we have is and how much hotter than that we are okay with our mining room getting. This will give us our biggest safe temperature difference. After that, we need to note down how many watts of power our mining equipment uses in total. We can then use these two variables to calculate the required airflow using the formula equipment power in watts multiplied by 3.097 and then dividing that by the temperature difference in Fahrenheit, and that will give us the needed airflow in CFM. Or if you're using Celsius, the formula is equipment power in watts multiplied by 1.721, and then you take that and divide that by the temperature difference in Celsius. And again, that will give you the needed airflow in CFM. Moving on, if you want to use an airflow setup with both active exhaust and active intake, both your exhaust and intake fans needs to be able to satisfy the needed airflow as calculated by that formula. They should also match each other in order to avoid pressure differences building up. And then on the other hand, if you want to use active exhaust but passive intake through, for example, vents, then the exhaust fans still need to satisfy the required airflow as calculated by this formula. And a good rule of thumb is that for the intake, you need about 40 square inches or 250 square centimeters of unrestricted intake per 100 CFM of exhaust. And keep in mind that if you are going to add stuff like gable vents or air filters on those intakes, that will significantly restrict the possible airflow, and you'll probably want to aim for at least 50% more intake in those cases. So let's wrap this up by looking at some real-life examples of setups for cooling your mining farm. Now, I will be recommending some actual products in this section, and I'll have links to those products down in the video description. Just know that those will be affiliate links, meaning I do get a small commission if you purchase something through those links at no extra cost to you. As a matter of fact, most of those links will be from the online store AC Infinity, where I actually have a discount code that you can use, which is just 𝗧, and that should give you 10% off on everything in your order. And you guys using that discount code really helps me out so that I can keep making stuff like this. I really appreciate it, so thank you very much for that. Hey guys, Editing 𝗧 here. So I just wanted to butt in real quick to say that if you are struggling with the heat of your mining farm and just can't seem to get a good cooling setup to work, there are a few like really helpful tools that you can get for that. So to start, you could get just like a pack of super basic digital thermometers like these ones. You can use them to just kind of measure the temperature in different spots of your mining room to help find any hidden hot pockets that might be building up somewhere, or to just check that the temperatures all around your mining room actually are what you expect them to be. I mean, as you can see, they're super cheap. This is a pack of 6 for like $10. A bit of a better option, if you can afford it though, is to get a thermal camera like this one, which, you know, obviously can really help you map out the temperatures of your whole mining room, basically. It'll give you just a much better overview of just how the heat is moving around the space and exactly where heat might be building up and how hot it's getting, obviously, all over the room as well. With a thermal camera like this, it can also help you in a lot of other ways. For example, it can help you find out if a single GPU is running too hot inside of a mining rig, or you can even use it to figure out and check if individual chips might be overheating on mining rigs or ASIC miners and stuff like that. Oh yeah, and another really good use for thermal cameras is to check the temperature of cables in your mining rigs or on PDUs and stuff like that, because you know, if a cable is getting too warm, it could be a really good indicator that it might be pulling too much power, which obviously could be unsafe if they melt and then become a fire hazard. But moving on from the thermal camera, another really good tool that you can get is one of these airflow velocity meters like this one. It's a really great tool for just making sure that air is flowing as it should all throughout your mining farm or mining room, and that stale air isn't building up somewhere, which, you know, is how hot pockets start forming, which, you know, cause issues inside of mining rooms. And then finally, if you do find that hot pockets are forming, you know, a lot of times you can fix that by just moving your miners around a bit and positioning them better, and that will solve the issue. But also a lot of other times, a super basic trick basically to fix that is to just get a, you know, basic table fan like this one to just kind of help mix the air around a bit. And that can be one of those like super basic, simple solutions that just work. All right, so what I'll do is I'll link all of these down in the video description, and yeah, now back to the video.
Now, let's start by looking at an effective setup if you don't have a dedicated space like a full room or shed that you can use for mining. And that setup is going to be using a grow tent. Grow tents are basically just indoor tents that are generally used to grow plants that require very specific temperature, air quality, moisture, and so on. But they are perfect for us as they are really great at containing heat and usually come equipped with a lot of ventilation options where you can attach intake and exhaust fans. AC Infinity has a lot of quality grow tents in a lot of different shapes and sizes, as you can see on this page here. For example, this one that has 5 8-inch ducting ports, which you can use together with this inline fan, either as exhaust or intake fan or both. For example, you could use 2 of these inline fans to pipe fresh air in through one side of the tent, and then another 2 to pipe the hot air out of the other side. Or pipe fresh air in through the bottom 2 and then pipe the hot air out through the top 2. Where you get the fresh air from and where you are exhausting the hot air out to is going to depend greatly on your actual situation. For example, you could get the fresh air in through a big vent and pipe the hot air out into your HVAC system to heat your house during winter, or just in through a window and out through a different window. It really depends on your setup, but you might want to get some flexible ducting like this as well, just to kind of help you pipe the air wherever it is that you need it to go. And finally, for this kind of setup, you could also get some air filters like these ones and just put those in front of your intake fans. This should help you avoid dust building up inside of your grow tent and should keep your mining equipment a lot cleaner so that you don't need to bring it all out of the tent and dust it off every couple of weeks or so. Now, moving on, if you do have access to a dedicated space for your mining, such as a full-on mining shed, you might instead want to go for something with an active exhaust and passive intake. A tried and true setup for this is to exhaust the hot air on one side using shutter fans like these ones, and then matching that with passive intake on the opposite wall through gable vents using something like these. And to filter your intake air, you can use these gable vents together with some cut to size filters like these ones. Again, this will help you avoid everything being covered in dust, pollen and debris, but it also does restrict your airflow, meaning you need more intake. So just keep that in mind. Now finally, if you have mining equipment that already has very directional airflow, like GPU server cases and ASIC miners, you can use that to your advantage to create a makeshift hot cold aisle setup. What that means is you can basically use the built-in airflow setup of the actual mining gear to pipe all of the hot air into a contained area where it can't escape back into the room with your mining equipment in it. And if you want to see how I've done just that for extremely cheap at home, then you can check out this video next. So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.